The morning started like any other at Clarence House. The sun had barely risen over London when the security team gathered for their daily briefing. Among them stood Detective Inspector James Morrison, a man who had served the royal family for 15 years. His reputation was spotless, his loyalty beyond question. He had protected princes, princesses, and high-ranking officials through countless events and potential threats. But nothing in his extensive training could have prepared him for what would unfold that. Tuesday morning, the call came through at precisely 7:30. Morrison was reviewing security protocols with his team when his radio crackled to life. It was the head of palace security, Sir Richard Beaumont, requesting his immediate presence in the administrative wing. The tone in Sir Richard's voice was different, urgent yet measured. The kind of tone that suggested something serious but not dangerous. Morrison excused himself and made his way through the familiar corridors, his shoes clicking against the polished marble floors. When he arrived at Sir Richard's office, he found 3 other officials already present. There was Lady Margaret Thornfield, the Chief of Staff, whose stern expression rarely softened. Beside her stood Thomas Aldridge, the royal household's legal advisor, a man known for his discretion and careful handling of sensitive matters. The third person was someone Morrison had only seen in photographs. Elizabeth Hartwell, a senior investigator from the Royal Archives Division. The presence of such high-ranking officials immediately told Morrison that whatever was happening, it was significant. Sir Richard gestured for Morrison to sit, but remained standing himself. He explained that they had received credible information regarding unauthorized items, potentially stored within the private quarters of certain royal residences. The information had come from a former staff member who had recently come forward with concerns about historical artifacts and personal items that might require official documentation and preservation. The matter needed to be handled with absolute discretion and professionalism. Morrison listened carefully as Sir Richard outlined the situation. Apparently, there had been growing concerns within the royal household about the proper cataloging and preservation of items belonging to senior royals. Over the decades, countless gifts, personal possessions, and historical pieces had accumulated in private wardrobes and storage areas. Some of these items might be of significant historical value, while others could raise questions about provenance and proper handling. The investigation was not punitive, Sir Richard emphasized, but rather a necessary audit to ensure everything was properly documented and preserved for future generations. The task was delicate. They needed someone with impeccable credentials and absolute trustworthiness to conduct an inspection of Camilla's private wardrobe and storage areas. Morrison had been chosen because of his years of service, his attention to detail, and his ability to handle sensitive situations with grace. He would be accompanied by Elizabeth Hartwell, who would document and catalog any items of historical significance. Lady Thornfield would oversee the process to ensure proper protocol was followed. Everything would be photographed, documented, and reported directly to the highest levels of palace. Administration Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He understood that he was being asked to enter one of the most private spaces belonging to the Queen Consort. Wardrobes were personal sanctuaries, places where individuals kept not just clothing, but mementos, letters, photographs, and items of deep personal meaning. To inspect such a space required not just authority, but also respect and sensitivity. He assured Sir Richard that he understood the gravity of the assignment and would conduct himself with the utmost professionalism. The team was given 2 hours to prepare. Morrison returned to his office and reviewed the protocols for conducting sensitive searches within royal residences. He checked his equipment, ensuring his documentation tools were in perfect working order. He also took a moment to center himself mentally. This was not a criminal investigation, he reminded himself, but an administrative procedure. Still, he could not shake the feeling that whatever they found might change things in ways he could not yet imagine. At precisely 10 o'clock, the team assembled outside the private wing of Clarence House. Camilla was away on official duties, and the household staff had been instructed to provide access while maintaining their regular routines. Morrison presented his authorization papers to the senior butler, who examined them carefully before nodding and leading the group. Through a series of corridors to the private quarters, the wardrobe room itself was larger than Morrison had expected. It was not ostentatious, but it was spacious and well organized. Rows of clothing hung neatly on racks, separated by season and occasion. Shelves lined the walls, holding shoes, handbags, and boxes of various sizes. There was a faint scent of lavender in the air, and the room was impeccably maintained. Natural light filtered through a single window, casting soft shadows across the polished wooden floor. Elizabeth Hartwell began the documentation process methodically. She photographed the room from multiple angles, noting the layout and organization. Lady Thornfield stood near the door, observing with her characteristic intensity. Morrison began his inspection, starting with the most accessible items. He worked carefully, examining clothing for any hidden pockets or items, checking boxes and containers with gloved hands. Everything he touched was treated with respect and care. The first hour passed uneventfully. They found beautiful gowns, many designed by renowned British fashion houses. There were shoes from various designers, some worn frequently, others seemingly kept for special occasions. Handbags were inspected and found to contain the usual items: lipsticks, tissues, small mirrors. There were photographs too, family pictures in elegant frames, images of horses and country estates. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary or unexpected. But then Morrison noticed something unusual. At the back of the wardrobe, behind a row of winter coats, there was a section that seemed different from the rest. The lighting was dimmer there, and the organization less meticulous. Several large boxes were stacked in this area, covered with protective cloth. Unlike the rest of the wardrobe, these boxes bore no labels or identification marks. They simply sat there, anonymous and unassuming, as if someone had placed them there years ago and forgotten about them. Morrison exchanged glances with Elizabeth. She nodded and approached with her camera. Lady Thornfield moved closer, her expression unreadable. Morrison carefully removed the protective cloth from the first box. It was made of sturdy cardboard, reinforced at the corners, the kind used for long-term storage. He lifted the lid slowly, unsure what he might find inside. The contents made him pause. Inside were bundles of letters, dozens of them, tied with faded ribbon. The envelopes were old, the paper yellowed with age. Morrison carefully lifted one bundle and examined the writing. The handwriting was elegant, clearly from a different era. He could make out partial addresses and dates from the 1970s. Beside the letters were several leather-bound journals, their covers worn but still intact. There were also photographs. Black and white images showing people in formal settings, garden parties, and private gatherings. Elizabeth began photographing everything while Morrison continued his examination. The letters appeared to be personal correspondence, but determining their exact nature would require careful reading by appropriate experts. The journals would need similar attention. What struck Morrison most was the sheer volume of material. These were not just a few forgotten items, but rather an extensive collection that had been deliberately stored and preserved. He moved to the second box. This one was heavier, and when he opened it, he found something entirely different. Inside were decorative items, small sculptures, ornate boxes, and what appeared to be antique jewelry. Some pieces were wrapped in tissue paper, others stored in velvet pouches. Morrison was no expert in antiquities, but even to his untrained eye, some of these items looked valuable. There were brooches with intricate designs, necklaces with stones that caught the light, and rings that suggested considerable age and craftsmanship. The room had grown very quiet. Lady Thornfield stepped forward and examined one of the pieces without touching it. Her expression remained neutral, but Morrison could see the wheels turning in her mind. Elizabeth continued her methodical documentation, photographing each item from multiple angles. Morrison made detailed notes, describing everything he saw with precision. The third box contained documents. There were official-looking papers, certificates, and what appeared to be receipts or inventories from various estate sales and auctions. Some documents bore royal seals, others were from private dealers and collectors. Morrison noticed dates spanning several decades, suggesting these items had been accumulated over a long period. The documents would need to be reviewed by archivists and legal. experts to determine their significance and whether proper procedures had been followed in acquiring the items they referenced. As Morrison worked through the boxes, a picture began to emerge. This was not simply a collection of forgotten items, but rather a carefully curated archive of personal history. The letters, journals, photographs, and objects together told a story, though what that story was remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that these items had never been properly catalogued or documented by the royal household. They existed in a kind of administrative limbo, neither officially acknowledged nor explicitly hidden. Morrison found himself wondering about the origins of this collection. Had these items been inherited, gifted, or collected over time? Were they personal treasures or historical artifacts that should have been in official archives? The questions multiplied with each new discovery. He maintained his professional composure, but inside he felt the gravity of what they were uncovering. The fourth and final box was perhaps the most intriguing. Inside, wrapped in layers of protective fabric, was a collection of artwork. There were small paintings, sketches, and what appeared to be preliminary studies by recognized artists. Morrison recognized a few signatures, names that commanded respect in the art world. These were not reproductions or prints, but original works, each one potentially worth a considerable sum. By the time they finished the initial inspection, nearly 3 hours had passed. The wardrobe, which had seemed so ordinary at first glance, had revealed itself to be something far more complex. Morrison, Elizabeth, and Lady Thornfield stood together, surveying the documented items spread before them. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken implications. Whatever happened next would require careful consideration and absolute discretion. The discovery initiated a chain of events that moved with surprising speed. Within hours of completing the initial inspection, Morrison found himself in a secure conference room at Buckingham Palace. The room was windowless, soundproofed, and equipped with the latest security technology. Around the large mahogany table sat individuals whose combined authority could influence the very foundations of the royal household, sir. Richard had called an emergency meeting. Present were Lady Thornfield, still wearing the same severe expression from earlier. Elizabeth Hartwell had brought preliminary documentation, hundreds of photographs stored on encrypted devices. There was also Lord Christopher Ashford, the keeper of the royal archives, distinguished historian in his 70s, whose knowledge of royal collections was encyclopedic. Joining them was Dame Patricia Goodwin, a legal expert specializing in cultural property and inheritance law. 2 other figures sat at the far end of the table. Representatives from the royal family's private office, whose names Morrison was not given. Sir Richard opened the meeting with characteristic directness. The discovery that morning had raised questions that needed immediate answers. The items found in the wardrobe represented potential gaps in the official records of royal possessions. Some pieces appeared to be of significant historical and monetary value. Others were of a more personal nature, but still required proper documentation. The challenge was to understand how these items came to be there, whether their presence violated any protocols, and what needed to be done to address the situation appropriately. Lord Ashford spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. He explained that the royal collections were vast and complex. Over centuries, members of the royal family had acquired, inherited, and been gifted countless items. While major pieces were meticulously catalogued, smaller personal collections sometimes fell through administrative cracks. This was not necessarily indicative of wrongdoing, but rather a reflection of the sheer volume of material and the evolving standards of documentation over time, however. Lord Ashford continued. Some of the items Morrison had discovered appeared in preliminary photographs to be pieces that should have been registered with the Royal Collection Trust. The artwork, in particular, included pieces by artists whose works were typically part of official holdings. If these pieces had been acquired through proper channels, there should be records. If no records existed, questions would naturally arise about provenance and acquisition. Dame Patricia addressed the legal dimensions. Her assessment was measured but serious. If any items had been acquired without proper documentation, or if gifts intended for the royal collection had been diverted to personal use, there could be implications under various regulations governing royal property. She emphasized that intent mattered greatly. Honest mistakes or administrative oversights were very different from deliberate circumvention of protocols. Her task would be to trace the history of each significant item and determine whether proper procedures had been followed. Elizabeth Hartwell presented her preliminary findings. She had identified approximately 40 items that warranted further investigation. These included 6 paintings or sketches by recognized artists, various pieces of antique jewelry, several historical documents bearing official seals, and an extensive collection of personal correspondence. The letters alone numbered in the hundreds, spanning multiple decades. She estimated it would take weeks to properly catalog and research everything they had found. Morrison listened as the discussion moved from technical details to broader implications. The officials were clearly concerned about more than just the items themselves. They worried about perception and precedent. If word of this discovery leaked to the press, how would it be interpreted? Would it be seen as a minor administrative oversight or something more troubling? The royal family had faced scrutiny before over questions of transparency and accountability. This situation, if mishandled, could reignite old debates and create new controversies. Lady Thornfield raised a practical question. Should the Queen Consort be informed immediately, or should they wait until they had more complete information? The room fell silent as everyone considered the delicate balance. On one hand, these were her personal possessions found in her private space. She had a right to know what was happening. On the other hand, approaching her prematurely, without clear facts, might cause unnecessary alarm or complicate the investigation. Sir Richard made the decision. They would conduct a thorough but expedited investigation over the next 2 weeks. During this time, they would trace the provenance of every significant item, review all relevant records, and consult with appropriate experts. Only after they had assembled a complete picture would they brief senior royals, including the Queen Consort. This approach would allow them to present facts rather than speculation, solutions rather than just problems. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Tasks were assigned, timelines established, and confidentiality protocols reinforced. Morrison was assigned to work directly with Elizabeth and a small team of researchers. His role would be to maintain security oversight while assisting with the physical examination of items. He would also interface with other security personnel to ensure the investigation remained confidential. As the meeting concluded, Lord Ashford approached Morrison privately. The elderly historian placed a hand on Morrison's shoulder and spoke in a low voice. He told Morrison that he had done the right thing by conducting the inspection professionally and reporting everything accurately. Whatever the ultimate findings, the integrity of the process mattered enormously. Lord Ashford also shared something that gave Morrison pause. He said that over his 40 years working with the royal collections, he had seen similar situations arise several times. The royal household was a complex institution where personal and official property sometimes became blurred. The key was always to approach such matters with both thoroughness and humanity. Over the following days, Morrison witnessed an investigation unlike anything in his career. Teams of experts descended upon the materials that had been carefully transported to a secure facility. Art historians examined paintings under specialized lighting, comparing them to catalog records and auction histories. Jewelry specialists assessed pieces, some dating back centuries, trying to match them to gift records or acquisition documents. Archivists carefully opened and read letters. Wearing white gloves and working in climate-controlled rooms, Morrison found himself fascinated by what they uncovered. The letters, it turned out, formed an extensive correspondence between Camilla and various friends and family members over several decades. They were personal, touching, and completely appropriate. But they also provided context for how some items had come into her possession. Friends who had passed away had left her things in their wills. Family members had gifted items during celebrations or difficult times. The letters showed a woman who valued relationships and memories, who kept things not for their monetary value, but for their emotional significance. The journals were similarly revealing. Written in Camilla's own hand, they documented thoughts, feelings, and experiences across many years. Researchers who read them, bound by strict confidentiality agreements, reported that they showed a thoughtful person grappling with the complexities of life in the public eye. There was nothing scandalous or inappropriate in the journals, just the private reflections of someone trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances. The artwork presented a more complex picture. 3 of the 6 pieces were indeed items that should have been part of official collections. They had been gifts to the royal family from foreign dignitaries or prominent citizens intended for public institutions. However, the paper trail showed that administrative errors had occurred years ago. Before Camilla had married into the royal family, the pieces had been delivered to the wrong address and had somehow ended up in her possession through a series of miscommunications. There was no indication she had knowingly kept items intended for public collections. The other 3 artistic pieces were gifts to her personally from friends who were artists. These required no special documentation and were entirely appropriate for her to keep. The confusion had arisen simply because some of the artists had later become more famous, making their work more valuable. But gifts given in private capacity remained private property, regardless of later appreciation and value. The jewelry proved most challenging to trace. Some pieces were clearly family heirlooms, passed down through generations with accompanying documentation. Others had been purchased at estate sales or antique shops over the years, receipts still carefully preserved. But several pieces remained mysterious, their origins unclear despite extensive research. These items were old, valuable, and beautiful, but how they had come into Camilla's possession remained uncertain. Dame Patricia worked tirelessly to resolve the jewelry question. She interviewed former staff members, reviewed decades of financial records, and consulted with experts on royal protocol and property law. Eventually, she uncovered an explanation. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, before stricter protocols were implemented, it had been common for royal family members to acquire items through informal channels. Estate sales, private dealers, and gifts from acquaintances often went undocumented. This was not unique to Camilla, but reflected practices that were common at the time. As the investigation progressed, Morrison observed something interesting about the team. Despite the serious nature of their work, there was no atmosphere of scandal or accusation. Instead, there was a sense of careful scholarship, of people trying to understand and document rather than condemn. They recognized that they were dealing with decades of accumulated personal history, not a crime scene. Elizabeth Hartwell, in particular, approached the work with remarkable sensitivity. She treated each letter, each photograph, each object as a precious piece of someone's life story. She often commented to Morrison about how the collection reflected universal human experiences. The desire to remember, to honor friendships, to preserve beautiful things. She saw the investigation not as exposing secrets, but as properly preserving history. By the end of the first week, a clearer picture had emerged. The vast majority of items in the wardrobe were entirely appropriate for Camilla to possess. They were personal gifts, inherited items, or things she had legitimately purchased. The few items that raised questions appeared to be there through administrative errors rather than any deliberate wrongdoing. The letters and journals, while private, contained nothing that would cause concern if they eventually entered historical archives. However, the investigation also revealed something that troubled Morrison. The sheer fact that such an extensive collection existed without proper documentation pointed to systemic issues within the royal household. If this could happen in one wardrobe, what about others? How many other collections of personal items existed in similar administrative limbo? The royal household needed better systems, clearer protocols, and more consistent documentation practices. Sir Richard convened another meeting to review the findings. This time, the atmosphere was less tense. Lord Ashford presented a comprehensive report, running over 100 pages, detailing every item and its provenance. Dame Patricia provided her legal assessment, concluding that while some administrative improvements were needed, there was no evidence of any improper conduct. Elizabeth submitted her complete catalog, a masterpiece of archival work that would serve as a model for future documentation efforts. The consensus was clear. The discovery, while initially alarming, had ultimately revealed administrative oversights rather than misconduct. The few items that should have been in official collections would be properly transferred and documented. Better systems would be implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. The personal items would be properly cataloged and could remain in Camilla's possession. The letters and journals would be preserved with appropriate security measures, potentially to be open to historians after a suitable period. Morrison felt relief wash over him. The investigation had been thorough and fair. They had approached sensitive material with respect while maintaining professional standards. The outcome reflected both the complexity of the situation and the integrity of the process. Yet he also felt a lingering concern. The investigation had consumed tremendous resources and caused significant anxiety, all because proper systems had not been in place from the beginning. The decision about how to inform the Queen Consort fell to Sir Richard and Lady Thornfield. They spent considerable time crafting their approach, understanding that how they presented the findings would matter as much as the findings themselves. They decided on a personal briefing rather than a formal report. Recognizing that discovering your private space had been inspected, even with proper authority, could feel invasive and distressing, Morrison was asked to be present at the briefing, primarily to answer any questions about how the inspection had been conducted. He found himself nervous in a way he had not been during the actual investigation. Examining objects was one thing, but sitting across from the Queen Consort and explaining why her private wardrobe had been searched was quite another. He prepared carefully, reviewing his notes and ensuring he could articulate every decision he had made. The briefing took place on a gray Wednesday afternoon at Clarence House. Camilla had returned from a week of engagements and had been informed that senior officials needed to discuss an important administrative matter. She entered the private sitting room where the meeting would occur with her characteristic composure, though Morrison detected a flicker of concern in her eyes. Sir Richard began with an apology. He explained that they had received information requiring them to conduct a documentation audit of items in various royal residences. The Queen Consort's wardrobe had been included in this audit. He emphasized that this was not an investigation of her personally, but rather a broader effort to improve record-keeping across the royal household. Everything had been done with proper authority and in accordance with established protocols. Camilla listened without interrupting, her expression difficult to read. Lady Thornfield then outlined what they had found, presenting it in the most neutral terms possible. Personal correspondence, journals, various gifts, and inherited items, some pieces that required additional documentation. She stressed that nothing discovered raised any concerns about impropriety. Rather, the exercise had highlighted the need for better systems to document personal collections. When it came time for Morrison to speak, he felt the weight of the moment. He explained how the inspection had been conducted with utmost care and respect. Every item had been handled with gloves, documented photographically, and treated as valuable. Nothing had been damaged or lost. The entire process had been conducted with a small team of trusted individuals, all bound by strict confidentiality. He wanted her to understand that despite the necessity of the inspection, they had tried to honor the private nature of her possessions. For a long moment, Camilla said nothing. She looked at each person in the room, her gaze thoughtful and assessing. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but tinged with emotion. She said she understood the necessity of proper documentation, especially given the public interest in the royal family. However, she also expressed how difficult it was to know that strangers had read her letters and journals, items she had never intended for anyone else to see. Those writings represented her most private thoughts, created during times of joy and struggle, never meant for public consumption. Morrison felt a pang of empathy. He had not read the letters or journals himself, but he knew others had, even if only to verify they contained nothing requiring official action. The invasion of privacy, though legally justified and carefully conducted, was still an invasion. He found himself wishing there had been another way. Knowing there had not been, Lady Thornfield acknowledged the difficulty, but gently explained why the review had been necessary. Without examining the contents, he could not determine what required official documentation and what remained purely personal. They had encountered situations in the past where historically significant documents had been mixed with personal items, only to be discovered decades later when memories had faded and context was lost. The review ensured that nothing of historical importance would be lost or forgotten. Camilla nodded slowly. She asked about the artwork and jewelry, the items that had caused the most concern. Lord Ashford, who had joined them for this portion of the meeting, explained the findings. He described the administrative errors that had occurred decades ago, emphasizing that she could not have known certain pieces should have been in official collections. He also clarified which items were entirely appropriate for her to keep, gifts given in personal capacity that belonged to her regardless of their value. The Queen Consort seemed to relax slightly as Lord Ashford explained. Ouch. She admitted that. She had sometimes wondered about the proper way to document gifts and inherited items, but had not known whom to ask. The protocols seemed complex and intimidating, and she had not wanted to bother people with what seemed like minor questions. She had simply kept things safe, intending to deal with documentation at some future point that never quite arrived. This admission led to a broader discussion about systemic improvements. Dame Patricia presented recommendations for clearer guidelines about personal property, regular consultations to help family members understand what needed documentation, and simplified processes for recording gifts and acquisitions. These changes would benefit everyone and prevent future confusion. They would also make the guidelines less intimidating and more accessible. Camilla engaged thoughtfully with these recommendations, asking questions and offering her own suggestions. She pointed out that clearer communication from the beginning would have prevented this entire situation. If someone had sat down with her years ago and explained the protocols in plain language, rather than presenting her with dense legal documents, she would have followed them carefully. The problem was not unwillingness, but rather confusion about complex rules. Morrison watched this exchange with growing respect. Rather than being defensive or angry, the Queen Consort was using the experience to help improve the system. She recognized that if she had found the protocols confusing, others probably did as well. Her suggestions were practical and came from genuine understanding of how the royal household functioned on a daily basis. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. Toward the end, Sir Richard asked if Camilla had any questions about the inspection itself. She turned to Morrison and asked him directly how he had felt conducting the search. The question caught him off guard. He answered honestly, explaining that he had found it challenging to balance thoroughness with respect for privacy, but that he had tried to approach everything with the same care he would want if someone were examining his personal belongings. Camilla seemed satisfied with this answer. She thanked him for his professionalism and for treating her possessions with care. She also thanked the entire team for conducting the investigation fairly, and for not allowing speculation or assumptions to influence their work. She acknowledged that the experience had been uncomfortable, but also recognized its necessity. She asked only one thing, that her letters and journals be sealed and stored securely, not to be opened except in extraordinary circumstances or after a substantial period had passed. This request was immediately agreed to. Dame Patricia assured her that the personal correspondence and journals would be treated as private documents, sealed and stored in the most secure facilities available. They would not become part of any public archive without explicit permission, or until decades in the future when historical perspective made their contents less personal. The Queen Consort's privacy would be protected to every extent possible. As the meeting concluded, something unexpected happened. Camilla asked if she could see the catalog Elizabeth had created. She wanted to understand what had been documented and how. Elizabeth, clearly surprised but pleased, brought out her beautifully organized catalog. Page after page showed photographs and descriptions, dates and provenance notes, all arranged with meticulous care. Camilla spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing the catalog, occasionally commenting on items and their stories. She corrected a few dates, added context to certain pieces, and expressed appreciation for the thoroughness of the documentation. Morrison realized that she was seeing her own collection in a new way, organized and presented as a coherent archive rather than random accumulations in a wardrobe. There was something therapeutic about it, seeing her life's accumulations treated as worthy of careful preservation. When she finally closed the catalog, Camilla made an observation that struck Morrison deeply. She said that everyone accumulates things throughout their lives, objects that carry memories and meaning. The difference for people in her position was that the line between personal and historical often blurred. A letter from a friend might someday interest historians. A gift from a state dinner might have cultural significance. Living with that ambiguity was challenging, and she appreciated that the investigation had helped clarify things. The officials left Clarence House that evening with mixed feelings. They had completed their tasks successfully and fairly. The Queen Consort had been informed and had responded with grace and understanding. Recommendations for systemic improvements had been developed and accepted. Yet Morrison could not shake a sense of disquiet. The investigation had been necessary, but it had also exposed the tension between public accountability and private life that everyone in the royal family navigated constantly. Over the following weeks, the recommendations were implemented. New guidelines were developed and distributed to all members of the royal family. Regular consultations were scheduled where family members could ask questions about documentation requirements in a relaxed, informal setting. A dedicated team was established to help with cataloging personal collections, making the process less intimidating and more manageable. Morrison returned to his regular duties, but the experience had changed his perspective. He had always understood intellectually that royal family members lived extraordinary lives, but now he had a deeper appreciation for the complexities they faced. Simple activities that others took for granted, like keeping letters from friends or buying jewelry at an estate sale, carried implications and required considerations that most people never encountered. Elizabeth Hartwell, meanwhile, had developed a new passion. She proposed a broader project to properly document personal collections throughout the royal household, not as investigations, but as preservation efforts. Her vision was to create comprehensive archives that would protect both historical materials and personal privacy, establishing clear boundaries and protocols that everyone could understand and follow. Her proposal was accepted, and she was given resources to begin the long-term project. Lord Ashford, approaching retirement, saw the entire episode as a fitting conclusion to his career. He had spent decades working with the royal collections, and this experience reinforced his belief that careful documentation served everyone's interests. Historical materials needed protection, but so did personal privacy. The key was developing systems that honored both priorities without compromising either. Dame Patricia used the experience to push for even broader reforms. She argued that the royal household needed to modernize its approach to property management, bringing in contemporary best practices from museums and archives while respecting the unique nature of the institution. Her advocacy led to the creation of a working group tasked with comprehensive reform of property protocols across all royal residences. As months passed, the initial anxiety about the discovery faded. The few items that needed to be transferred, 2 official collections were moved with appropriate ceremony and documentation. The personal items remained with Camilla, now properly cataloged and understood. The letters and journals were sealed and secured, their contents protected from unnecessary exposure. The new protocols began to take effect, making documentation easier and clearer for everyone. Morrison occasionally wondered what would have happened if he had not been chosen for that initial inspection. Would someone else have conducted it with the same care? Would the investigation have taken a different direction? He would never know. But he took pride in knowing that he had helped ensure the process was fair and thorough. He had protected not just physical security, but also the integrity of the institution he served. The story might have ended there, a successful resolution of an administrative challenge. But Morrison soon discovered that the ripples from that Tuesday morning inspection would continue to spread in unexpected ways. 6 months after the wardrobe inspection, Morrison received an unexpected summons. He was asked to meet with the king himself at Buckingham Palace. The request came through official channels, but with an unusual note stating, this was a personal meeting rather than a security briefing. Morrison prepared carefully, unsure what to expect, but understanding that such meetings were never trivial. He arrived at the palace on a crisp autumn morning. The leaves in the gardens had turned golden and orange, creating a beautiful backdrop against the historic stone buildings. He was escorted not to the usual security offices, but to a smaller, more intimate study that the king used for private conversations. The room was lined with books, comfortable furniture arranged to encourage discussion rather than formal presentation. The king entered a few minutes after Morrison, accompanied only by a single private secretary who took notes. After brief pleasantries, the king got to the point. He had received comprehensive reports about the wardrobe inspection and the subsequent reforms. He wanted to hear directly from Morrison about the experience, particularly about how the process had been managed and what lessons had been learned. Morrison spoke carefully but honestly. He described the initial uncertainty, the challenge of balancing thoroughness with respect, and the relief when the investigation revealed administrative oversights rather than misconduct. He praised the professionalism of everyone involved, from Elizabeth's meticulous documentation to Dame Patricia's fair legal analysis. He also shared his observation that the real problem had been systemic, gaps in protocols that had allowed confusion to develop over decades. The king listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. He seemed particularly interested in Morrison's description of the briefing with the Queen Consort. When Morrison mentioned Her Grace under difficult circumstances and her constructive suggestions for improvement, the king nodded knowingly. He commented that his wife had always possessed remarkable dignity and had never allowed personal discomfort to prevent her from doing what was necessary. Then the king surprised Morrison by sharing his own perspective. He explained that when he had first learned about the inspection, his initial reaction had been anger. The idea of officials searching through his wife's private belongings had seemed intrusive and potentially disrespectful. However, as he had reviewed the reports and understood the reasoning, he had come to appreciate the necessity of what had been done. More importantly, he had recognized that the royal family needed to modernize how they managed personal property. The king spoke about the burden of living in the public eye, where every possession could become a subject of scrutiny and every gift carried potential implications. He described how difficult it was to maintain any sense of privacy while also being accountable to public expectations. The wardrobe inspection had highlighted this tension in stark terms, forcing everyone to confront questions they had previously avoided. But rather than dwelling on difficulties, the king wanted to discuss the future. He revealed that the episode had prompted him to authorize a comprehensive review of how the entire royal household managed personal property. He wanted clearer distinctions between official and personal items, better support for family members navigating complex protocols, and transparent processes that could withstand public scrutiny. The reforms initiated after the wardrobe inspection were just the beginning of a broader transformation. Morrison listened with growing understanding. What had seemed like a potentially damaging discovery had become a catalyst for positive change. The king was using the experience to push for modernization that might otherwise have faced resistance. By addressing problems proactively, rather than waiting for scandals, the royal household could strengthen both its integrity and public trust. The king then asked Morrison for his opinion on security implications of these changes. Greater transparency about possessions meant more documentation, which could create security vulnerabilities if not properly managed. How could they balance openness with protecting sensitive information about the royal family's personal property? Morrison offered several suggestions, drawing on his years of experience with security protocols and his recent exposure to archival practices. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, ranging across topics from specific security measures to broader philosophical questions about monarchy in the modern age. Morrison found himself impressed by the king's thoughtful approach. He was not defensive about the problems that had been uncovered, but rather determined to use them as opportunities for improvement. He asked difficult questions and listened carefully to answers, even when they challenged his assumptions. As the meeting concluded, the king thanked Morrison personally for conducting the inspection with professionalism and sensitivity. He acknowledged that Morrison had been placed in a difficult position, but had handled it with integrity. He also mentioned that Morrison's discretion throughout the process had been noted and appreciated. The fact that no details had leaked to the press demonstrated the trustworthiness of everyone involved. Morrison left the palace feeling energized. He had entered the meeting with some trepidation, unsure how the king viewed the entire episode. He left understanding that the royal family, or at least its head, recognized both the necessity of what had been done and the opportunity it presented for positive change. The experience had transformed from a source of anxiety into a point of pride. Over the following year, reforms continued to unfold. Elizabeth Hartwell's documentation project expanded across multiple royal residences. Teams of archivists worked alongside family members to create comprehensive catalogs of personal collections. The process was voluntary and collaborative, designed to help rather than investigate. Family members appreciated having expert assistance in understanding what they owned and how to properly document it. The new protocols proved effective in practice. Clear guidelines eliminated confusion about what needed documentation. Regular consultations provided opportunities to ask questions without fear of judgment. A dedicated support team made the process manageable rather than overwhelming. What had once seemed like bureaucratic burden became a useful service that protected everyone's interests. Dame Patricia's broader reforms also took hold. Modern inventory systems were implemented, drawing on best practices from major museums and cultural institutions. Digital catalogs replaced outdated paper records, making information more accessible while maintaining appropriate security. Training programs educated staff about proper handling of valuable items and sensitive documents. The entire property management system became more professional and transparent. Lord Ashford, before his retirement, compiled a comprehensive history of royal property management spanning centuries. His work documented how practices had evolved, where problems had arisen, and what lessons could be learned. The wardrobe inspection became a case study in his final report, an example of how administrative oversights could accumulate over time, but also how they could be addressed constructively when discovered. Morrison's career continued to flourish. His handling of the sensitive inspection earned him recognition within security circles. He was promoted to a more senior position with broader responsibilities. But more than the professional advancement, he valued the personal growth the experience had provided. He had learned to navigate complex situations where right answers were not always obvious, where competing values needed to be balanced, and where sensitivity mattered as much as thoroughness. The story of the wardrobe inspection never became public. No journalist discovered what had happened. No insider leaked the details. The discretion maintained by everyone involved protected both the process and the people. This silence was not a cover-up, but rather a recognition that some matters, while requiring thorough investigation, did not need public airing. The problems had been addressed, the reforms implemented, and the lessons learned. Public revelation would have served no purpose except to generate headlines. Yet within the royal household, the episode became something of a legend. New staff members heard carefully edited versions of the story, used to illustrate the importance of proper documentation and the value of addressing problems proactively. The experience shaped how the institution thought about property management, privacy, and accountability. It became a reference point for discussions about modernization and reform. Camilla herself seemed to find peace with what had happened. In conversations with close friends, she occasionally mentioned that having her collection properly documented had actually been liberating. She no longer worried about whether she was keeping things correctly, or whether her children would understand the significance of various items. Everything was cataloged, contextualized, and preserved. Her legacy, at least in terms of her possessions, was secure. Elizabeth Hartwell went on to publish scholarly papers about archival practices in royal households. Though she never mentioned the specific case that had inspired her work, her methodologies were adopted by other institutions, both royal and non-royal, helping to improve documentation practices internationally. She became recognized as an expert in her field, invited to consult with organizations around the world. Morrison maintained periodic contact with many of the people he had worked with during the investigation. They formed a sort of informal network, individuals who had shared an intense experience and emerged with mutual respect. Occasionally, when facing new challenges, they would reach out to each other for advice or perspective. The bonds formed during those intense weeks proved lasting. As years passed, Morrison sometimes reflected on that Tuesday morning when he had first entered Camilla's wardrobe. He thought about the boxes hidden behind winter coats, the letters tied with faded ribbon, the journals documenting private thoughts. the artwork and jewelry accumulated over decades. He remembered the moment of discovering items that did not match official records. The uncertainty about what it meant, the careful investigation that followed. What struck him most in retrospect was how easily the situation could have gone differently. If handled less carefully, the inspection could have become adversarial rather than collaborative. If approached with suspicion rather than fairness, it could have damaged relationships and created lasting resentment. If conducted without sensitivity, it could have felt like persecution rather than documentation. The outcome had depended not just on following protocols, but on the character of the people involved. Morrison also thought about the broader implications. Every organization, whether royal household or private company, faced similar challenges. How do you balance accountability with privacy? How do you enforce necessary rules without crushing individual dignity? How do you address problems when you discover them without creating blame and defensiveness? The wardrobe inspection had been a test case in navigating these tensions. The experience had taught him that authority carried responsibility beyond simply following orders. He had been authorized to conduct the inspection, given legal backing for every action he took. But authority alone would not have produced the successful outcome. That required judgment, sensitivity, and constant awareness of the human dimensions of his work. He had been inspecting not just objects, but someone's life, someone's memories, someone's private world. He had learned that thorough investigation and respectful treatment were not opposing goals, but complementary ones. Being thorough meant documenting everything accurately, missing no detail, following every lead. Being respectful meant treating items with care, recognizing their emotional significance, and understanding that behind every object was a person with feelings and dignity. The best investigations honored both imperatives. Years later, when Morrison trained new security personnel, he sometimes shared carefully edited versions of the story. He used it to illustrate the complexity of their work, the importance of discretion, and the need to balance competing values. He emphasized that their job was not just protecting physical security, but also protecting the integrity and dignity of the people they served. That required more than just following procedures. It required wisdom, empathy, and constant awareness of the human consequences of their actions. The wardrobe inspection ultimately became a success story, though one known only to a small circle. Problems had been identified and addressed. Systems had been improved. Relationships had been strengthened rather than damaged. The royal household had become more professional and transparent without sacrificing appropriate privacy. Everyone involved could look back on the experience with pride in how it had been handled. For Morrison personally, it remained a defining moment in his career. He had faced a challenging situation with high stakes and uncertain outcomes. He had made difficult decisions under pressure. He had balanced competing priorities and navigated sensitive relationships. And he had emerged with his integrity intact and his reputation enhanced. The experience had tested him and proven his capability in ways that routine assignments never could. The boxes in Camilla's wardrobe, once sources of uncertainty and concern, had become properly documented parts of a personal archive. The letters and journals were sealed and secured, their contents protected for future generations who might appreciate them with historical perspective. The artwork had been sorted, with pieces properly allocated to official or personal collections. The jewelry had been cataloged, its provenance understood and recorded. Everything was in order, properly managed and preserved. But more than the physical outcome, the episode had created positive change in how the royal household operated. New systems prevented similar problems from developing. Clear protocols eliminated confusion. Support services helped family members navigate complex requirements. The institution had become more professional while remaining humane, more accountable while respecting privacy. The wardrobe inspection, which might have been merely an awkward episode, had become a catalyst for meaningful improvement. Morrison stood at his office window one evening, looking out over London as the sun set. He thought about that morning months ago, when he had received the call that would send him to inspect Camilla's wardrobe. He had worried then about what he might find, uncertain how to handle whatever discoveries awaited. Now, with the benefit of time and perspective, He understood that the real discovery had not been about objects at all. It had been about how institutions could address problems constructively, how authority could be exercised with wisdom, and how difficult situations could produce positive outcomes when handled with integrity and care. The silence that had fallen over officials that first day had not been despair, but rather recognition that they faced a moment requiring their best efforts, and they had risen to meet it.